The search for truth has never ceased, and one mind still stands as a guiding light. Welcome to the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Reed. I'm Dr. Jason Reed, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Theology and Philosophy Department at Divine Word College Seminary. In addition to teaching seminarians and religious at Divine Word, I also teach those in formation for the Permanent Diaconate Program in the Archdiocese of Dubuque, offering courses like the Philosophy of God, Christology, Metaphysics, Epistemology, and Trinitarian Theology. Here, we walk in the footsteps of St. Thomas Aquinas, exploring the mysteries of existence, the nature of God, and the pursuit of wisdom that shapes the soul. That journey begins now. Welcome to the Thomistic Mind again. I'm Dr. Jason Reed, Professor of Philosophy at Divine Word College Seminary. And today we begin another episode. In this talk, we continue our exploration of the nature of logic itself, and we pick up where we left off last time with the nature of an argument. Right, as we said last time, our world emphasizes critical thinking, misinformation, reliable sources, but it's done with very loose treatments, and there's almost no real clarity on what does it mean to be critical, what does it mean to be reliable, what does it mean to think. And so what's missing in many people's formation, intellectual formation, education, is a genuine training in how reasoning works. Not what to think, but how to think, how to evaluate, how to draw conclusions, etc. And so the last talk was focused on argument. We spent a lot of time talking about the structured group of statements, how arguments' job is to convince the readers and hearers that a conclusion is true because of the premises entailing it, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of information on the previous episode on all of those topics, which would be episode 9. But now we're moving away from, or we're moving beyond arguments, and now we're going to move on to logic itself. And so that's what today's focus is going to be. What is logic? And how is it to be used? What is it? So the first attempt to understand logic in a deeper way is to understand that logic is a serious study. Logic is the serious study of arguments from the perspective of reason itself, or under the auspices of reason itself. I'll say that again, I'll break it down. Okay, hopefully if you may be writing this down or just thinking about this, try to get your head around the idea that logic studies arguments. Logic studies arguments. And not just study it, it's a serious study. It's a focused study. It's an intentional study. Okay. By and from what perspective? Reason itself. So in a strange way, logic is reason looking at itself. And this is why a lot of beginning students in logic have a hard time, because you don't study seeing by seeing itself. You don't hearing itself, but reason can think about itself. Right? Reason can look at itself, and reason can contemplate reason. And when it's doing that, it's being logical. And so when you're doing logic, when you're doing the serious study of arguments, we're not simply interested in expressing our opinions, nor are we discussing ideas. We are examining, we are looking at how reason operates, how reason goes about doing its work. And so this is not the same thing as psychology, right? Reason doesn't look at how one is thinking, right? Reason isn't trying to describe how people feel, how people form their beliefs, why people do what they do, although that's a very interesting science. Logic is looking at reason, or is reason looking at how it operates, and reasoning finding out how it ought to operate. That is, reason is self-correcting. And the primary aim of logic, the primary aim of reasoning looking at itself, is for reason to look at argument evaluation. The primary task of logic, when it looks at arguments from the standpoint of reason, it's evaluating argument, full stop. Okay, so logic asks this: is this conclusion supported by the reasons given? Right? Logic asks, does the conclusion actually follow? Logic asks, is this reasoning sound, or has something gone wrong along the way? In other words, logic is reason examining itself. Reason examining itself. And this is where we can see how, like Thomas, and why the Thomistic mind is so needed in the world today. Why? Because of our world's lack of confidence in reason. We are suspicious of reason, says the culture. Right? There is no such thing as objective reason. Everyone has their own biases, says the skeptic. Everyone has an angle, says the cynic. What does God say? Come, let us reason together. Right? Go back to those first, the beginning episodes of this channel, of these shows, of these episodes, showing that the church and God and in scripture and tradition has confidence in reason, because reason is how we are like God. And so logic is faded, just as the confidence in reason has faded. And is it any coincidence that confidence in reason, or being skeptical of reasoning, or a life of the mind, that is, that confidence is waning, comes a corresponding disbelief in God? That is, disbelief in God tends to be correlative to disbelief in reason. So if we want to get belief in God back, we've got to get belief in reason back. Hence, we need someone like Thomas Aquinas. We need a Thomistic mind. We need to have confidence and faith in our reasoning faculties. Now again, this is not saying, right, just because reason examining itself, we're not saying that we're these robots and that we just, we're these rationalists and we're simply motivated by reason and that's it. Right? That's the error of the Enlightenment. The error of the Enlightenment is that reason is sufficient for motivating the human being. That is, that just the appeal to reason is all that's needed to convince people that something is true, to govern a society, etc. I mean, we can liken it to, we can liken rationalism, the Enlightenment, like to parenting styles. Right? There are some parents who parent in this way. Here are the rules, here's the truth, and either you understand the rule, and either you follow the rule or you don't. If you follow the rule, you'll be rewarded. If you don't follow the rule, you will be punished. Well, that's treating people like they're nothing but a mind. And human beings are not just minds. Human beings are embodied minds, right? Human beings have emotions and feelings and desires and interests and longings for the good. We want to see the beautiful. So, right, I'm not advocating that we're just reasoning, examining itself like a pure mind, free from all passions. Right? Nothing like a Kantian just analysis of pure reason. We're not giving a critique of pure reason. But we can't throw reason out. Human beings still have reason. We can still examine it. It's not always super easy, but it is something that we should do. And in a sense, it's been done. Logic is a developed branch of knowledge, is a developed science, And reason is examining itself. And one of the things that reason will show you, especially when you get into more deep philosophy and theology, is that reason can tell you when it's limited. But part of the task, or one of the interests in doing philosophy, is to know when reason should submit, when reason says, okay, this is beyond my capacity. For example, like the Trinity. One of my colleagues was just teaching on the Trinity to like Introduction to Theology 101, and he said to me, my head hurts. He said, I'm so tired. So the Trinity is so hard. Like, yeah, of course it is. Even when you try to do the Trinity simply, there's no way to do a simple presentation of the Trinity. It's impossible. Why? Because things like the Trinity, the Incarnation, reason, and philosophy has met its match. Like, this is just beyond you. And so logic helps you use your reason to examine yourself, and so you can become more objective. The more that you allow and you think through your reasoning, the more that you subject your reasoning to its own self-analysis, then you'll become more objective. Now, there's no one that's absolutely objective unless you're God. But objectivity can come in degrees. And so you can become more objective. You can become more of a critical thinker. There's no doubt about that. And so when you're studying logic, again, logic is reason examining itself. And what is reason asking? What is reason asking itself? Well, it's asked itself something like the following questions. Reason asks itself, am I thinking correctly? Am I thinking correctly? Am I following the rules of inference? Or am I being too motivated by my own bias? Am I thinking correctly? Or, reason asks itself, am I drawing conclusions properly? Am I being hasty in my inferences? Have I thought this through well enough? Or, reason asks itself, am I recognizing when I shouldn't draw a conclusion at all? Is reason's asking, do I know when I shouldn't infer something? Do I know when I need more? And so as reason reflects upon itself, it does give rise to this science of logic. And so logic is reason's self-reflection. That is, the science of logic is the fruit or the results of reason's own self-reflection. Why? Because as reason self-reflects, it discovers something about itself. It discovers something about how to find truth. It discovers how truth is discovered and how truth should not be discovered. So we can put it simply, part of reasoning self-reflection, part of studying logic, and I'm going to say this slowly, I'm going to repeat myself, okay? Part of studying logic, the fruit of self-reflection, the fruit of reasons looking at itself, is that you're going to learn to recognize when the truth or falsity of a statement, call it A, when the truth or falsity of A implies the truth or falsity of another statement, call it B, and when it doesn't. This is a nice, simple statement of what you learn in logic. You're learning when the truth or falsity implies something about the truth or falsity of something else, and when it doesn't. When are implications to be made, and when are implications not to be made? When are implications being made, and when are implications not being made? This is what logic trains us to see. You'll be able to see certain things. You'll be able to think through certain things. That is, logic is it's like weight training for the mind. It's like weight training for your reason. It's going to be able to do this. It's going to have the strength and the insight to see, I should conclude that, I shouldn't. So logic, and this is where the education comes in. Again, this is what's really missing. This is what a Thomistic mind has. This is what Thomas Aquinas taught. Not just what we think, right? Logic doesn't train us what to think. That's why I have taught logic to people from all different faiths, all different worldviews, all different backgrounds, all different cultures. Because when I'm training people in logic, I'm not telling them what to think. We're training them on how conclusions should be drawn or not. Again, this is the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed. I'm Dr. Reed, and I'm a teacher here, a professor at Divine Word Seminary, and we're looking at the real insight of logic, the sort of the whole point of it all, what I've been driving at for the last couple of months, trying to get us to see, what does it mean to think logically? What does it mean to have a Thomistic mind? What's the beginning of having a Thomistic mind? It's being trained to see not what to think, but how to know when the conclusions are being drawn and when they're not. So what does reason discover? Reason discovers it can and does make mistakes. Reason does discover, and logic does express, right, the mistakes that reason can and does make. So one of the outcomes of reason's self-analysis is that it discovers the rules or principles that correctly guide thinking. That's true. But also discovering the mistakes that she makes. That is, reason, our reason discovers, here are the mistakes that we make. And so this introduces a very important concept in logic, a very important concept when it comes to thinking. And that concept is the fallacy. The fallacy. Fallacy is a technical word, and it means a mistake in reasoning. Mistakes in reason, mistakes in logic, are called fallacies. And there are two different types. They're formal and informal. And so therefore there are two different types of mistakes. Sometimes reason makes mistakes and how it orders its premises to each other and to the conclusion. For example, we may infer a conclusion when there is an illicit implication should be made. Again, if you ever watch court TV, if you watch movies that are centered in a courtroom setting, this is the logic behind the objection. So in a courtroom setting, I think that's a nice window into logical thinking. In a courtroom, you're making a case. You're trying to make a case and show that a certain conclusion is true, right? The prosecution is trying to show the conclusion so-and-so is guilty is the conclusion. Of course, the defense is trying to show that that conclusion hasn't been shown, right? So when an argument's being made, when the lawyer is interrogating a witness, then you'll hear the opposing lawyer say, "Objection, Your Honor." And what's the objection? The objection is based in this concept of a mistake. It's based in the concept of fallacy. That is, the case that the lawyer is making, whether it be the other lawyer, the opposing side, is that there's a mistake. That is, they are asking the jury to make an inference when they shouldn't make one, like hearsay, or leading the witness, or move to strike, all those standard things, right? So if you're watching these movies, I love movies that are based in courtroom settings. That's what it's all about. But again, here's what I'm giving you, what we're talking about now, is the logical foundation for theories in jurisprudence. Right? In order for jurisprudence, in order for there to be fairness in the law, right, be fairness and justice in a courtroom, it's got to be logical. So again, being logical isn't some sort of just abstract, true or false calculation. No, logic has to do with ethics too, right? Not only should an argument be a good one, but when you're trying to make a case against someone under the law, it needs to be a logically good argument. And therefore, if you have a good lawyer can pick out those fallacies, these mistakes, because What's the implication? If the judge sustains the objection, the judge is saying, yes, that was a mistake. Throw that out. Don't include that. That's a mistake. That's an error. And that's why the jury should not listen to it. Okay? So these would be called formal fallacies, right? So when a lawyer objects and says that conclusion doesn't follow, then you're claiming there's a formal fallacy. And again, and as we go through some more of these talks, as I dive deeper into these episodes, you'll learn more about what the fallacy is and examples of formal fallacies. Okay? And so formal fallacies have to do with the structure of the argument. Hence, they're called formal, right? The other type, or variety of fallacies, are mistakes in how terms are defined, whether a premise is relevant, considering factors that have nothing to do logically with the truth of a matter. Right? And mistakes like these are called informal fallacies. And these are the dominant mistakes that are made online. Right? Attacking a person, faulting a view because where it comes from, excuse me, begging the question against somebody else, so on and so on, appeals to authority, things like that. So these are informal fallacies because they're not really about the structure of the argument. They deal with whether or not there's any relevance, whether or not the terms are clear or not. And so those are called informal fallacies. Okay, so, right, reason as it's thinking is becoming aware of its mistakes. And so when it becomes mistakes, there is a science of fallacies, right? There is there are books written on fallacies. There's a good one called Without Good Reason. It's the title of the book. It does a good job on fallacies. So logic then has these two parts, right? It's the study, logic, then we can kind of wrap this up, what logic is, right? Logic is a study of arguments. How so? It's reason, study of reason. That's what logic is. It's the reasons looking at reason. Why? In order to find truth by discovering the correct ways to draw conclusions. That's the first thing. How do we correctly draw conclusions? And as important, secondly, to avoid errors in our reasoning. So logic, this is what this is the Thomistic mind. What does it mean? A Thomistic mind that's trained, an education person that's trained, is aware of the correct ways to draw conclusions and the incorrect ways to draw conclusions, right? That is, the mind that's logical, the mind that's Thomistic, the mind that's Catholic, is trained to avoid errors in their reasoning. So hopefully that's clear enough. Again, you can go back and listen to that again. But that's what logic is in a nice summary statement. Now, as we move forward, we're going to be making some very important concepts. It seems like I say that a lot, right? All these things are important. Maybe that's the whole point. Like any distinction is really important. Well, here's one of those really important things. In logic, we must distinguish. Again, if you remember anything about today's talk, if there's anything you remember about logic, if there's anything you're going to remember from here on out, it should be this. And that is not an overstatement. The difference or the distinction between the concepts of validity and truth. To this day, in all my philosophy classes, on every single class I teach, at the final, I ask the students, what's the difference between define and explain the difference between validity and truth. If you're going to get a bachelor's degree, if you're going to be a student of mine, you're going to have tattooed in your head, in your brain, in your soul, the distinction between validity and truth. It's easy to forget. I remember I was just quizzing a student who took logic years ago, and they were kind of vague about validity. This is something you just have to know. It's one of those non-negotiables, like the Trinity, 3 persons in one God. The Incarnation, Christ is 1 person in 2 natures. Just standard understandings of things. So hopefully I've made my case. Hopefully I've made my point, right? Validity and truth. So first, I want to give a clear and more of an academic understanding, then a little more formal, and then something concise and plain. So I'm going to work from the more difficult to the clearer, or the more plain understanding. So what's a clear and academic understanding of validity? Here it is. When the conclusion of an argument truly follows from its premises, the argument is said to be valid, or the argument is said to be a good one. When the conclusion of an argument truly follows from its premises, actually is entailed by, then the argument is said to be valid. Now, in logic, what's validity? Validity means that the connection between the premises and the conclusion is a good one. In logic, validity means that the connection between the premises and the conclusion is correct. And what's the definition of good and correct? It's good because that connection is such that it's simply impossible for those premises to be true, all of them, and the conclusion false. So that's the clear academic understanding of validity and truth. We're coming up on the end of our first segment here of today's episode. This is the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed from the seminary at Divine Word. And so we are talking about very important concepts, validity and truth. All right. Don't confuse validity with, say, the garden variety of validity. Like, that's a valid point. It's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about valid points. We're not talking about valid points of view. We're not talking about whether or not your permit is valid, or if your driver's license is valid, or your construction is valid, the construction permit is valid. No, we're talking about the connection between premises and conclusions. That's what valid means. And so when the conclusion of the of an argument really is implied by the premises, then we say that's a good argument. That's a valid argument. And so you see the point. In a valid argument, if you get the listener to accept the truth of the premises, then they're logically committed to the truth of the conclusion. Jesus does this all the time. Paul does this all the time. Right? The Catechism does this all the time. When it's trying to convince you of something, of a teaching, of a doctrine, it's getting you to see and to accept the premises. That's what the Sadducees do. Right? And the Pharisees. They're giving arguments. They're trying to get the Lord to conclude something. They're trying to get the Lord to infer something. And so they offer the Lord premises. Why? Because if he accepts those premises, then the idea is then the Lord should accept the conclusion. And vice versa. So that's the clear and academic expression. When we come back after this break, please stay with us. There's a brief commercial break. We'll come back and we will revisit this clear and academic, then move on to the more formal and then more concise. So please stay with us. Be back in about 2 minutes. The Church teaches that a solid education and grounding in philosophy is necessary to find the truth and avoid error, to understand the mysteries of divine revelation, to grasp the Church's doctrine, and to engage an unbelieving world. Philosophy is so valued by the Church that she requires it to form the intellectual life of her priests. Read Thomas is an online program created to make this intellectual formation more widely accessible. Developed and taught by Dr. Jason Reed, the courses combine academic rigor with a spirit of faith, presenting the great themes of classical and Thomistic philosophy in a way that is clear, structured, and faithful to the Catholic intellectual tradition. Participants encounter fundamental questions of philosophy through topics such as the pursuit of wisdom, an introduction to philosophy, an overview of philosophy's origins, methods, and enduring questions. There's He Who Is, examining the classical view of God's attributes and their theological and spiritual implications. We also have the mystery of existence, the philosophy of creation, exploring the metaphysical principles underlying the doctrine of creation. Then we have the three-person God, the mystery of God's inner life, a philosophical study of the Trinity's interrelations. There's also St. Thomas Aquinas' Philosophy of the Angels, where we consider the nature and role of spiritual beings in Thomistic thought, and further courses that engage the treasures of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Read Thomas seeks to cultivate not only knowledge, but also a deeper appreciation of the harmony between faith and reason, helping participants enter more fully into the wisdom of St. Thomas Aquinas and the Church's philosophical heritage. The website is www.readthomist.com. That's www.readthomist.com. The email is read.thomist@gmail.com. That's reed.thomist@gmail.com. At Read Thomist, we believe the life of the mind is for every Christian. And we're back to the next segment, the second half of the show, where we are talking about validity and truth, which I have made great pains. Maybe it's a bit of annoying, hope not, but to really drive home the point that validity and truth are not the same. And what I've begin to discuss their difference by focusing on validity. And validity is something that concerns how conclusions are drawn from premises. And I ended with the academic expression that validity means, at least in logic, that the connection between the premises and the conclusion is a good one, that the connection between the premises and the conclusion is correct because it's impossible that the premises all be true while the conclusion is false. Okay, and again, as we dive into some of the examples, which I'll give later, if not in this episode, in the next episode, we'll look at some of Christ's encounter with the Sadducees, Christ's encounter with the Pharisees. So stay tuned, right? I'm trying to build, give you vocabulary, help you to understand and what a Thomistic mind is, what a intellectually formed mind is, who thinks logically, who can think through premises, who can understand arguments, can understand inferences, so that when we dive into, right, the church's teaching, or if we're diving into what Christ is teaching or what Paul is teaching, or if we listen to arguments online, or if we're having debates, it's all be more fruitful. Okay. All right. So that was a clear and academic. So now let's move into a slightly more formal expression of validity, and then I want to end with a concise and plain one. Okay. So an argument, more formally stated, is considered valid. An argument is considered valid, or an argument is considered good. That is, good and valid are the same, and it becomes an argument, when its conclusion necessarily follows from its premises. Again, in logical terms, validity requires that it is impossible for all the premises to be true, and the conclusion falls at the same time. You see the objective nature of it. You see the ability to reason with someone, right? When the Bible says to demolish arguments, when the Bible says to defend the truth, when the Bible says to give a reason for your hope, this is going to help you do that. Because when you give a reason for the hope that's within you, or if you're trying to demolish arguments set against the knowledge of God, if you're trying to love your God with all your mind, you can think logically. That is, if you're trying to show, say, atheism is false, you're trying to give a valid argument, trying to get someone to see that if you accept these premises, then the conclusion that God exists must follow. That's the point. You want to give good arguments, right? God wants good arguments. What's a good argument? Well, for a Thomistic mind, for a logical mind, good arguments are valid. So, the concise and more plain statement, right? Simply stated, an argument is valid when its conclusion logically follows from its premises. An argument is valid when the conclusion logically follows from its premises. What does all that mean? That all that means is that if you accept all the premises, if they're true, the conclusion cannot possibly be false. It's not possible for the conclusion to be false in a good argument if the premises are true. Okay. Now, an argument is not valid. This is the easiest part of today's talk. If an argument's not valid, it's invalid. If an argument's not valid, it's said to be invalid. Okay, so let's look at some examples of valid arguments. Valid arguments. Okay, here's a valid argument. The standard in all textbooks, the first argument you ever hear in a logic class is the following. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. That is valid. Second example, all dogs are dinosaurs. Premise 2, Lassie is a dog. 3, therefore Lassie is a dinosaur. As we'll see, that's valid. Third and final example comes from St. Paul. If there be no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is not risen again. Then Christ is not risen. If Christ has not been risen, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. Some say there is no resurrection of the dead. Therefore, now this is my logical analysis of this. Here's what follows what St. Paul is teaching. Therefore, some are logically saying your faith is in vain. So again, we have 3 examples. These are all valid. Right? All men are mortal is a valid argument. Dogs being dinosaurs is a valid argument. And there being no resurrection of the dead argument. These are all valid. Now, the point here is one must see why the arguments are valid. Why are these arguments valid? Because it seems silly, right? I mean, maybe Dr. Reed's lost his mind. That could still be true. But anyway, you have to see why the arguments are valid, and that's why you'll see the distinction between validity and truth. Okay, let's take the obvious and silly one. The obviously false. No dog is a dinosaur. That's obviously true. But that misses the point when it comes to validity, right? And this is the point. A validity is not concerned directly with the truth. That is, validity is not asking whether or not it's true that dogs are dinosaurs. Validity isn't asking that. Validity isn't concerned with whether dogs are dinosaurs. The only thing that validity thinks about, the only thing that validity, that reason's looking at, is whether or not the premises entail or imply that conclusion, full stop. So why is the silly argument valid? Here's why. Because if it is true that all dogs are mammals, all dogs are dinosaurs, if it's true that all dogs are dinosaurs, and if it's true that Lassie is a dog, then it must also be true that Lassie is a dinosaur. That is, the truth of Lassie is a dinosaur logically follows premises 1 and 2. And that's it. So silly things can be valid. Right? Very silly arguments can be valid. Right? Either God exists or the moon is made of green cheese. Well, the moon isn't made of green cheese, therefore God must exist. Okay? Valid, but silly. Okay? What about St. Paul? How is St. Paul's argument that there is no resurrection valid? Well, he's not strictly denying the resurrection. St. Paul is not denying the truth of the resurrection. What's he saying? He's making a logical point. He's making the logical point of what follows from denying that the dead are raised. That's the point. If the dead are not raised, and that's true, then the Christian faith is all in vain. If the dead are not raised, the Christian life and all the sacrifices required to live it, if there is no resurrection from the dead, then all the things that we do to live a faithful Catholic or Christian life is a fool's errand. As a matter of fact, if a person denies the resurrection, what's the actual logical thing to do? Well, St. Paul says immediately after this, he says, if with merely human hopes I have fought with wild animals at Ephesus, what would I have gained by it? That is, if he's simply living a life on merely human hopes, if the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. That's very logical. It's very logical that if there is no tomorrow, you might as well party today, because you haven't got it tomorrow. I mean, you see how neat that is? I mean, not neat that you should eat and drink and be merry, but the idea that denying the resurrection of the dead and trying to say that the Christian life is still meaningful, that's illogical. It's irrational. That's what Paul's driving at. It's irrational to deny that the dead are raised and then claim that the Christian life is worth living. It's a vain life. It's a fool's errand. If the dead are not raised, go have a party. That's the logical thing to do. Interesting, isn't it? Now, of course, his argument is that, well, the Christian life is not a fool's errand. And to say that, well, then you must say that he rose from the dead. Okay, why? Because Paul's making a valid argument. But logically follows no resurrection, if you deny the resurrection, if you deny Easter, live as a hedonist. Okay, so that's what logic is. That's why those arguments are logically valid. Those arguments, the silly one with dogs being dinosaurs, the non-Christian one that there's no resurrection of the dead, are simply good arguments in the sense that they are structured well. The connection between its premises and the conclusion is a good one. That's all that means. Okay, now, what do you call an argument that's not valid? We said it's invalid. Now, let's look at some bad arguments. Bad meaning what? That they're invalid. Here's one. Evil is not a substance. All substances are created by God. Therefore, evil is not created by God. That's a bad argument. Next one. What can be perceived by the senses exists. The soul's existence cannot be perceived by the senses. Therefore, souls do not exist. It's a bad argument. Lastly, all who have faith in Jesus are saved. Jones does not have faith in Jesus. So, Jones is not saved. Invalid. Bad arguments. Why are they bad? They're not bad because the conclusion is wrong. Right? Let's go over that first one. The conclusion to the first one is evil is not created by God. Christians want that to come out true. We don't want to say God created evil, like full stop. We don't want to say that God made, Judas Iscariot. He's the one that created Judas Iscariot's betrayal. But if this is the argument for trying to defend God from evil, it's a bad one. Evil is not a substance. All substances are created by God, and those two being true do not entail that evil is not created by God. That is, evil not being created by God does not follow those two premises. That's why it's a bad argument. Or how about the atheist or the skeptic or the materialist who denies that there are souls? This is if a naturalist or a skeptic or an atheist is denying that their souls exist based on this argument, then it's a bad argument. How is it bad? Well, what can be perceived by the senses exists if that's true. And if it's also true that the soul's existence cannot be perceived by the senses, that's also true. Souls not existing doesn't follow. That's why it's bad. Not that it's false that souls don't exist. That's not why. Their argument's bad because those two premises do not entail the conclusion. That's the point. Same thing with those who have faith in Jesus are saved, and Jones doesn't have faith, so Jones is not saved. Jones not being saved doesn't follow those two premises. It just doesn't. That's why they're invalid. Okay? We're not talking about the truth of the matter. So we have to make a serious distinction. We have to note, we have to understand that when we're talking about logic, valid and invalid is a technical term and applies only to arguments. It applies only to arguments. And that's it. Okay? Arguments are valid or invalid. Arguments are good or bad. Statements are never valid or invalid. So again, validity applies to arguments, never to statements. However, now this is what truth is. Truth, on the other hand, and falsehood, are properties of statements, and therefore they are properties of premises and conclusions. Premises are true or false. Conclusions are true or false. You don't have a true argument. There aren't false arguments. You don't have valid premises or invalid conclusions. So please, do not confuse truth with validity. There is no such thing as a true argument. There is no such thing as a valid statement. Okay, so keep that distinction in mind. That's why I hammer all the time in my classes. Truth and validity should not be confused. Okay? That is, so when we say the argument is, there's no such thing as a true argument. Arguments don't declare something to be real, right? The argument doesn't by itself make a claim about reality, right? Arguments aren't statements. They're composed of statements. What composes the argument can be true or false. That's the idea. Moreover, another thing to keep in mind, don't fall into the trap of thinking that if an argument is invalid, that means the conclusion must be false. That's not how logic works. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that if an argument's invalid, its conclusion must be false. And don't fall into the trap of thinking if the argument is valid, its conclusion must be true. That's not how it works. Invalidity simply means that the conclusion doesn't logically follow. So if I said, so here, so there's an invalid argument for God exists. Here's an invalid argument that evil is not created by God. All that means is that evil not being created by God didn't follow the premises that were offered. It doesn't tell us anything about whether that is true, the conclusion is true or not. That is, validity doesn't tell us anything about whether the conclusion happens to be true or false. So yes, an argument can be terrible in its reasoning and still have a true conclusion. I'll repeat that. An argument can be terrible. It can be really bad, even though the conclusion itself is a really good one, the conclusion we want to be true. For instance, there are lots of really bad arguments. Lots of invalid arguments that nevertheless end with the true statement God exists. One of my, I think it was my logic professor in seminary, was working on a book on bad arguments for true things, was the name of it. If memory serves, it's been a long time ago since I took that class, but I remember him talking about that. Okay, just keep in mind, an argument can be really bad in its reasoning. Like the inference is terrible, even the conclusion's a good one. So what's the takeaway? Invalid reasoning doesn't automatically mean a false conclusion. Invalid reasoning doesn't automatically mean a false conclusion, and valid reasoning doesn't automatically mean a true conclusion. It just means, invalidity just means a conclusion isn't supported by the argument given, or the conclusion is supported. So here's some examples of invalid arguments, or here's just one example, of God. An invalid argument for the existence of God. Premise 1, if God exists, the miracles are possible. Premise 2, miracles are possible. 3, God exists. That's a bad argument. And by bad we mean incorrect. And by incorrect we mean invalid. Why is that invalid? Even if you convince someone that 1 and 2 are true, you've given them no reason to think that 3 is true. I'll say that again. Even if you convince someone that 1 and 2 are true, that does nothing to convince us that 3 is true. That is, 3 is undetermined from 1 and 2. Again, if you're just listening, I'll say it again slowly and see if you can't see the error. If God exists, then miracles are possible. Miracles are possible. Therefore, God exists. That's invalid. To give you an argument that follows that same pattern. Considering this argument. If fire exists, there's oxygen. There's oxygen. Therefore, there's fire. Doesn't follow. If an animal is a cat, it's a mammal. This animal is a mammal, therefore it's a cat. Doesn't follow. These are bad arguments. Now again, it doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. Okay? Just because the argument's a bad one doesn't automatically mean that God doesn't exist. It just means that the argument's a bad one. So, when the scripture says we must give an apologia for the hope that is within us, we must love God with our minds, we must refute false ideas about God, it's asking us to give good arguments and avoid bad ones. And so it at least means this, right? In order to follow the divine imperative, the biblical imperative, and even this in the church, this is why in the program for priestly formation, or why Catholic schools offer logic, so that we can fulfill the divine imperative to reason well and to love God with our minds. And so you have to ask yourself, if I'm struggling with, or if I've never understood valid and invalid, that means I haven't understood in a clear way the distinction between good and bad arguments. And then finally, if I don't know the difference between good and bad arguments, then I could be possibly giving bad arguments for the hope that I have. I may be not really destroying an argument against the knowledge of God. I think I am, but maybe arguments are bad ones. This is how logic helps you. It's going to help you understand when an argument's a good one and when's a bad one. Okay, this is the Thomistic Mind, which is a show dedicated to having a Thomas Aquinas inspired mind, a Thomistic type mind, an intellectually formed mind. And so we've been going on here for several months now, and now we're diving deep into the nature of logic. And logic has as a foundational distinction valid and invalid when it comes to arguments. Arguments are either valid or invalid. Okay, I think I've made the point. Okay. So we have about 5 minutes left of this this episode, and I want to just take the remaining time to introduce a concept to you called the concept of the syllogism. The concept of the syllogism. We looked at what an argument is, looked at how logic operates, we looked at valid and invalid. Okay. And then, of course, analysis statements. So let me just repeat that. Let's try to give us a focus where we are. I talked about arguments. Arguments are composed of statements. Some statements are premises and some are conclusions. Those statements, when they're put together, are either valid or invalid. Okay. They have mistakes or they don't. The next idea is called a syllogism, which is going to be a kind of argument. Now, if you've seen other interviews I've done, or if you've seen me in other contexts talk about my life as a philosopher, I often say that philosophy, in a sense, really saved me. And I meant it. Philosophy did save me. And a big part of that saving was being introduced to one of the most powerful tools in logical thinking, the syllogism. The syllogism is important because once you understand how syllogisms work, it can open your mind. It sharpens your ability to think clearly. It strengthens your power of thinking critically. Again, it's what really saved me. It helped me learn how to think. And so what is a syllogism? What is a syllogism? Well, simply put, a syllogism is a deductive argument, so it's an argument, typically with two premises and a conclusion. That's it. It's simple in its structure. So you got two premises, the conclusion follows. Two premises, the conclusion follows. So it's either the premises, two premises give you the conclusion or they don't. And part of its incredible power is found in its simplicity. Because it's simple, it's easy to understand, and because it's easy to understand, we have to deal with it more. And so much of Christian teaching, so much of specifically New Testament teaching is done via the syllogism. If you're ever going to give a homily, or if you're teaching a class, or if you just are engaging with someone, if you can give syllogisms, they're very powerful. Because syllogisms are guiding the mind to the conclusion. For example, here's a simple syllogism based on the scripture. There is no one who seeks God. No one. That comes out of Romans. Well, I'm one of those no ones. I am a one. Therefore, what's true about me? I don't seek God. But that is a sobering truth. Very simple truth. Extremely sobering. Extremely powerful. There is no one who seeks God. No one. Well, I'm a one. What's he saying about me? I don't seek God. Well, then how do I find God? I don't find him. I don't seek him. He seeks me. He finds me. There's a great line. It's in it's a movie on St. Augustine. I hope it's true. Where St. Augustine, before he's a Christian, comes across St. Ambrose. And St. Ambrose was talking about the truth. And the St. Augustine character very flippantly said, who can find the truth? Right? He just said it very sarcastically. And St. Ambrose, just dead in his eyes, just seriously looked at St. Augustine and said, oh, young St. Augustine, you don't find the truth. The truth will find you. So it's a powerful line. Again, incredibly powerful thoughts. It's a simple syllogism. Simple syllogism. Okay, well, that's going to be it for today. This is the end of our episode, the end of this talk. And hopefully, again, stay with us, and we'll dive into different kinds of syllogisms. We'll talk about what are kinds of different syllogisms, and we'll start really looking at examples from the scripture. So, see you soon. You've been listening to The Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed, produced by Mr. Matt Graham. To learn more about our rigorous philosophy courses, visit us online at www.readthomis.com, www.readthomist.com. It's been a privilege to journey with you through the world of philosophy, seeking truth, goodness, and beauty together. My hope is that today's conversation encourages you to think more deeply, live more wisely, and love more fully. Until next time, keep your mind fixed on the truth